And so to make sense of that flow of change, within which there is no entity to be found, we create things like cups in our conceptual framework to make sense of this flow. So the cup that exists is that cup that we've created in our conceptual mind to make sense of that flow. So that cup is something merely labelled on that flow. And of course, we need to do that, otherwise we can't function. So there's nothing wrong with that. Similarly with the person, is now there seems to be a body here moving through time, but if we look closely, there's just flow of change. And on that flow of change here, we tend to label body, because that's something meaningful and useful for us. Similarly, the mind. It seems like the mind is a thing moving through time, but again, if we look closely, there's just a flow of mental experience. And to make sense of that, we tend to label mind or consciousness on that. Similarly, person. There seems to be a me here moving through time. But there's just physical flow and mental flow. And me is something we're merely labelling on that flow of body and mind, which are just flow. So there's no entity, me, moving through time. However, and actually that's why we can have a functioning world. Because, for example, if this cup was a cup from its own side, objectively, if it had a unique nature of being a cup from its own side, it couldn't change. You couldn't create it, you couldn't destroy it, it couldn't function. But because it has no unique nature of being a cup from its own side, therefore you can create it, you can destroy it, it can function. Similarly with everything. So actually, this view of emptiness, the flip side of emptiness is dependent arising, or in other words, functioning world. That is the correct understanding of emptiness. But then another doubt comes up, and that is, yeah, but if I'm not here, there's still a world here, isn't there? Is there? Big and small. You take away big, is still small there? No. And isn't the world defined by what we experience? And I'll just quote a couple of quotes I mentioned earlier in the field of physics. Because remember, historically physics was all about measuring that supposed independent objective world that's out there. And so they've been spending 3 or 4 centuries trying to do that. But now they're coming to realise, actually, maybe there is no independent objective world out there to be measured. And so we've got a couple of quotes here, again, first from John Wheeler, who was one of the towers of theoretical physics in the 20th century. And he says, "Useful as it is under everyday circumstances to say that the world exists out there, independent of us, that view can no longer be upheld. There is a strange sense in which this is a participatory universe." And then, again quoting from this quantum physicist Anton Zeilinger from University of Vienna, who has a lot of discussions actually with His Holiness Dalai Lama. And it's very interesting that His Holiness Dalai Lama is quite amazed at how Anton Zeilinger, through running experiments, can come up with more or less the same view as this view of emptiness. And Anton Zeilinger is amazed at how people like Dalai Lama can come up with that quantum view through meditation. Very interesting. Anyway, he says the following. One may be tempted to assume that whenever we ask questions of nature, of the world existing outside, there is reality existing independently of what can be said about it. We will now claim that such a position is void of any meaning. It is obvious that any property or feature of reality out there can only be based on information we receive. There cannot be any statement whatsoever about the world or about reality that is not based on such information. It therefore follows that the concept of a reality without at least the ability in principle to make statements about it, to obtain information about its features, is devoid of any possibility of confirmation or proof. This implies that the distinction between information, that is knowledge, and reality is devoid of any meaning. And one more thing, which I didn't quote before, which I find quite fascinating, is that there's a field now called quantum cosmology. And quantum cosmology, what they're doing is, of course, quantum mechanics is examining the very smallest components of reality. And they have developed principles there. But now what some scientists are doing is that they're applying those quantum principles to the macroscopic universe. And that's called quantum cosmology. And what they find is when they apply those quantum principles to the macroscopic universe, time drops out of the equation. There's no time. And that time only comes in if you introduce an observer. And so this is what, again, this physicist Andre Linde, who's a professor of physics at Stanford University, he says the following. Without introducing an observer, we have a dead universe, which does not evolve in time. And this re-emphasises the role of the participant in the self-observing universe of quantum cosmology. The universe becomes alive, i.e. time-dependent, only when one divides it into two parts, a subjective observer and the rest of the objective universe. And the wave function of the rest of the universe depends on the time measured by the observer. In other words, the evolution of the universe and everything in it, including life itself, is possible only with respect to the observer. I find that quite interesting. Any questions?
Who is understanding?
Sorry?
Who is trying to understand something?
Who? You.
I'm asking myself.
You. So remember, and this is something we'll cover a little bit this afternoon, is to, in our developing our understanding of emptiness, to really hold functionality. If we are losing functionality or causality, our understanding of emptiness is going to nihilism. And this is really the key point and the difficult point. Because again, we talk about the two extremes. For us now, there's only two possibilities. Either there is a real, functioning, independent world, or there's no world. So it seems like emptiness and functioning world are contradictory. But actually, they're two sides of one coin. And it's not so easy to find that middle way between the extremes. And of course, the way to overcome those extremes, we overcome the extreme of existence through this Vipashyana practice of emptiness, to come to see that nothing exists independently. And of course, then, if we are misinterpreting that not finding as nothing really exists, we're sliding into nihilism. And if we're sliding into nihilism, then we need to really reflect on dependent arising. To really understand dependent arising, and that will really help us to avoid the extreme of non-existence. So emptiness, dependent arising are like two sides of a coin. If we appreciate that, we've found the middle way. And it's not easy. I hear sometimes people who supposedly have been studying and meditating and they're Buddhists for some years, and I still hear people say things like, oh, it doesn't matter because everything's empty. This is completely the wrong view. This is nihilism. The correct view is, because things are empty, everything matters, everything functions. And because things function, they must be empty. That's the correct view. That's what we are hopefully coming to, that view.
Say it again.
Because things are empty, everything matters or everything functions. And because things function, they must be empty. That's the correct view. That's the middle way between the two extremes. And we'll look at that a little bit more this afternoon.
I just want to share my understanding of what they may exist, but not the way I see it.
Correct. Like everything.
I see it as a solid thing.
Solid, independent.
Is my experience, but
yeah, sure.
in reality, it's constant flow. Like I grasp it.
Yeah, and so that's why impermanence is so helpful. Because as we've seen, this idea of emptiness is difficult, to appreciate.
Yes.
Impermanence, certainly at this sort of basic level, is not difficult. The idea of flow, So if we go there and we start to really have that experience, it's getting, like I said, we're very close to emptiness, so close. So close. And of course, flow, it's easy for us to see causality in flow. Here, with emptiness, it seems to negate causality. But when you go to flow, therefore, causality. That's easy to see. We see this in the world, flow, and we see causality. So that's easy to hold together. Where emptiness and causality is not so easy. Merely labelled and causality seems to be contradictory. But flow and causality, that's easy.
So should we neglect a bit the emptiness practice to make the impermanence practice stronger so we can...
I wouldn't neglect it.
Not neglect, but just...
I wouldn't neglect, but what I would do is practice some emptiness, and not just once or twice, of course. Really put some effort into it. But if you're really finding that you are really flying off to nihilism or completely confused and not really making any headway, then we would go back to impermanence and work up. But because the thing is, if we have a little bit of ability to focus, and I'm not talking, stage 6 or 8 in Shamatha, if we can have a little bit of ability to focus, and we do these sort of practices correctly, you can have very strong experience. And that very strong experience can have a very strong impact on us. Probably only lasts for a short time, maybe for a few moments, a few minutes, a few hours, but because we've had that experience, that really will be motivating us enormously to pursue, not a grasping thing, because often what people do is they have an experience and go, oh yeah, I like that, and we try to recreate it. Then we're just grasping. But if we have some sort of experience, then that would really validate to us that maybe this is true and maybe I can really overcome my mental afflictions and suffering. Maybe that's possible. Let's do this now in a systematic way. Ethics, concentration, wisdom, Tonglen, 4 measures. Put that package together and we can really make some significant progress. Okay, last question.
It's not a question, it's just reminding me what you said about all the physicists quotes. A story by Isaac Asimov, a short story, I don't remember what it's called, but it goes like this in a very short way. People are building a supercomputer that answers every question, and then now and then people are asking how to reverse entropy. And the computer always says not enough data. So the question is like, can we? But people are moving on. And then millennia and millions of years pass and people transcend into being only minds that with bodies somewhere and eventually the universe collapses into itself and everything goes away. But the computer is like, it's out there in the hyperspace, I don't remember what it's called. And then that's when the computer finally has the answer how to reverse entropy. But then there's no one to give the answer to people.
So the moral to the story is?
No.
But the computer is not part of the cosmos?
But then the story ends by the computer saying, well, there will be light. And then, so that answers my question of how can there be like 14 billion years of the universe existing without an observer? Well, maybe that's how.
But again,
that's one answer.
yeah. But okay. But anyway, there's a lot to be said on that. But let's break there for lunch now.